Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, sold as slaves for a couple of $100s. UN investigators in Libya speak to African migrants who say there is a shameful trade in human lives there. Victims suffer extortion, abuse, and are even murdered. Also, they're warning that a massive funding shortfall is slowing down the critical response needed to the deepening hunger crises in Nigeria, Somalia, and South Sudan. We take a closer look at the challenges in Somalia. And in Ivory Coast, the prosecution delivers its summing up in the case of the 2011 post-election crisis killings in Abidjan's Novotel. But first, the UN's uncovered a disturbing slave trade of migrants in Libya. The International Organization for Migration's taken testimony from Africans who've headed to the country in hope of starting a new life. Some have told of traffickers buying and selling people in garages and car parks for as little as $200. Many victims are subsequently subjected to starvation, forced labour and prostitution, and even murdered. It's a brutal face of the migrant crisis, and I'm joined now for more on this by Leonard Doyle. Leonard, thanks very much for speaking to us. Now tell us more about what people have been telling your investigators about enslavement in Libya.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on. What we've been hearing for a number of months, but with increasing frequency, is that migrants who unwittingly leave from all over West Africa, primarily, hoping to get a better life in Europe, end up being lured into Libya and into a gulag, which is the only way to describe it, of appalling abuse, which results in their being sold on from one person to another. They're being sold to the highest bidder in these farms, and women being enslaved as sex slaves. So it's just a shocking series of appalling abuses, and many times the migrants are indeed just murdered if it appears that they either don't have the skill or they don't have the money to pay for their way. So it's just the scale of what we're hearing is shocking.
So who's buying these people and how are they finding them?
Well, what we're finding is that Libya is now a broken economy without any rule. It's got a very small population, 6 million people, and the size of Libya is twice the size of France. So it's a small population, and they seem to be essentially living off the migrant trade, from migrants being passed from one to another, being exploited as laborers who don't get paid, or simply being abused in different ways and being sold on for profit. So it's kind of a shocking situation, and it's very difficult to know what can be done about it because the country is in such chaos, and as we know, ISIS are there. There are different militias. There's no central government of any name, and there's great chaos, and it's a huge problem for Europe because it's a gaping hole on the southern flank of Europe, as an ambassador recently described it.
Do you think there's much of an awareness on the side of those migrants who are setting out to Libya that this is one of the risks that they could be faced with?
I mean, I think this is the problem. Every migrant believes that they're going to get through, they're going to make it to Europe, and they're going to make a small living. But whatever it is, it's going to be more than what they have at the moment in their appalling situation. Usually it's a problem of poverty, or maybe it's advancing climate change is taking away their crops. Whatever it is, they feel that they need a better life to support their family. The trouble is that it's very difficult to persuade people not to take this journey. And in the absence of a state and of borders that are controlled, the people just keep coming. So what we are trying to do in the International Organization for Migration is use those we are bringing home. Many, after a terrible time in Libya, decide it's time to go home, and we bring them home. And we bring them home with a message that they put on social media or they have on their local radio, and to start a discussion with their communities about maybe that there are better choices in life than to put yourself in the hand of the enslaved, of the slave keepers.
Thank you very much. Leonard Doyle there for us, joining us from the International Organization of Migration. Well, northeastern Nigeria, Somalia and South Sudan are falling deeper into hunger crises because of drought and conflict. UN's warned that tens of millions of people are at risk if the growing humanitarian crises are overlooked. It's put out an appeal for almost $4.5 billion in funding, but has received less than a quarter of that so far. Meanwhile, the situation continues to deteriorate.
Some 20 million people in these countries are in areas affected by drought. 4.2 million of them are refugees. Consecutive harvests have failed. Conflict in South Sudan, coupled with drought, is leading to famine and outflows of refugees. Insecurity in Somalia is leading to rising internal displacement, and rates of malnutrition are high, especially among children and lactating mothers.
As you heard there, Somalia is one of the countries of main concern. We take a look now at some of the difficulties it's facing, one of which is its third famine in 25 years.
Forced from their homes in desperate search for food and water, these Somali families have walked for days to find refuge in the southern city of Bedoa.
I come from a village called Shabella. We left our home because of the drought, and we came here because we are so hungry.
Somalia is facing its third famine in 25 years. In 2011, more than 250,000 people died, and experts fear this time it could be worse. After successive seasons of poor rains and failed harvests, emergency supplies are low. The Turkish Red Crescent is delivering 70,000 tons of aid to displaced people across the country. Somalia is the main beneficiary of Turkey's interest in Africa. President Erdogan sees Somalia as a crucial sphere of influence and has visited the war-torn country 3 times in 5 years, signing 15 bilateral agreements. But the Turkish Red Crescent says it intends to help the entire region affected by the drought.
We are not working only for Somalia. We started a campaign for Somalia, for Yemen, and for South Sudan, because as the East Africa, they need support and they are regionally affected.
It's estimated that 6.2 million people, more than half of Somalia's population, are in need of emergency food aid. And the crisis is worsening, with more than 300 deaths from cholera and diarrhea since the beginning of the year.
Well, Zambian opposition leader Hakainde Hichilema was arrested on Tuesday after police raided his house overnight. His lawyer claims that he faces treason charges after his vehicles allegedly obstructed President Edgar Lungu's motorcade on a main road. Hichilema, head of the UPND, narrowly lost last August's presidential elections. He says the vote was rigged and that he doesn't recognise Lungu as leader. Zambia is known for its relative stability, but international observers did report that the polls were marred by intimidation. Burundians who'd long lived on land that's been earmarked for the construction of a new presidential palace say that their homes are being destroyed and that they have nowhere else to go. Much of the building is funded by China and is underway at Gasenyi Hill, northeast of Bujumbura. But although some locals being forced out have received compensation, others have not. They were, nevertheless, given until last week to leave. That deadline's now passed, and the destruction of remaining houses has reportedly begun.
We have nowhere to go. No one can shelter us right now because of the famine. No one has much to eat. We're going to become beggars in the street. The state just abandoned us. We're going to die, and no one has even bothered listening to us.
Well, in Abidjan, prosecutors in the trial of 10 people accused of kidnapping and killings at a hotel 6 years ago wrapped up their case on Tuesday. 2 of the victims caught up in the post-electoral violence were French. Arnaud Froger tells us more.
The abduction and the murders happened in early April 2011, just a week before Laurent Gbagbo got arrested at a time of bloody clashes between soldiers from the former regime and fighters supporting newly elected President Alassane Ouattara. After 6 weeks of trial and a video footage of Gbagbo soldiers kidnapping the foemen at the Novotel, the prosecution claims the victims were then tortured and eventually killed at the presidential palace. The prosecutor requested life in prison for the 5 main defendants, but none of them acknowledged being involved. None of them told the court where the 3 missing bodies were buried. It's an aggravating circumstance, according to the victim's lawyer.
Un procès de cette nature était aussi fait. This trial was an opportunity for the defendants to talk so that the victims and their families could eventually know what happened during the last moments of Yves Lambelin and Stéphane Frantz de Rippel's lives. And with that, they could have eventually found out where the bodies were dumped. But now we will unfortunately never know, and that's what we regret about this trial.
The defense team makes its final arguments on Wednesday. They'll admit the four men were killed at the presidential palace, but say it was by French bombings and not by Gbagbo soldiers. The victim's lawyer says it's a revisionist version of history. The verdict is expected on Thursday.
Arnaud Froger there for us in Abidjan. That's where we're going to have to leave it now for Eye in Africa. Thanks for watching us. Do so again if you can. Take care.
Because a new page of history gets written every day. Because breaking news can't wait. Information. Everywhere. In all situations. On every subject. Understanding the world. Imagining the world. France 24, a different take on the news.